In January 2024, the CEO of Microsoft stood in front of the world and compared a $199 gadget to the original iPhone. The gadget was called the Rabbit R1. It was small, orange, and designed to replace every app on your phone with a single AI that could just do things for you. No tapping, no scrolling, just talk to it. The launch video hit 5 million views in days. 100,000 people placed pre-orders before a single unit shipped. Units were selling on eBay for double the retail price before anyone had touched one. 6 months later, reviewers were calling it the worst tech product of the year. The AI didn't work. The battery was a disaster, and buried inside the device, security researchers found a flaw that would have allowed anyone to read every private conversation every R1 had ever had, and remotely brick all 100,000 of them simultaneously. Rabbit had known about it for weeks. This is the story of Rabbit R1, a company that was pivoting away from NFTs just 2 months before it convinced Microsoft's CEO it had built the future. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to 2021. Jesse Liu is not the founder you'd expect behind a story like this. He's not a dropout, not a garage tinkerer, not someone who stumbled into tech from nowhere. He's sharp, polished, and he had already built and sold a company before most people in Silicon Valley had heard his name. He grew up in Shenzhen, studied financial mathematics in Liverpool, and in 2014 founded a company called Raven Tech, which he took through Y Combinator, the world's most prestigious startup accelerator. In 2017, Baidu acquired it for roughly $90 million. He was 27 at that time. At Baidu, he worked alongside Teenage Engineering, a Swedish design studio with a cult following for making some of the most beautiful hardware ever built. That relationship would come back around. Then Sam Altman called him. This was before ChatGPT, before the AI boom, when GPT-3 was still something most people outside research labs had never seen. Altman showed Liu what OpenAI was building, and Liu walked away convinced that the smartphone era was about to end. His idea was called a large action model, an AI trained not on text, but on video footage of humans using apps and websites. Watch enough people book a flight, order food, send an email, and eventually you can replicate the behavior yourself. No apps required, no interface to learn. The AI just handles it. He spent 3 years building it. What he didn't mention in those pitches, and what almost no one knew at the time of the CES launch, was that 2 months earlier, the company had been called something else entirely, and had been building something else entirely, but we'll get to that. January 9th, 2024, CES, Las Vegas. Jesse Liu walked onto a stage holding a small orange device and gave the kind of product presentation that makes the entire tech industry stop scrolling. The Rabbit R1 was $199. Designed by Teenage Engineering, the Swedish studio, whose hardware people display on shelves like art. It fit in your palm. It had a scroll wheel, a camera, and a push-to-talk button. And the pitch was simple enough to tattoo on your wrist. You don't need apps anymore, just talk to it. The launch video hit 5 million views. Pre-orders opened expecting to move 500 units on day 1. They moved 10,000 in 48 hours. Batch after batch sold out. A 6th batch of 50,000 was announced before the first devices had even shipped. Units appeared on eBay at double the price. Kausala Ventures, one of the most respected names in Silicon Valley, was in. Total funding reached $64.7 million. And then Satya Nadella, CEO of Microsoft, compared the Rabbit R1 launch to Steve Jobs unveiling the original iPhone in 2007. That single sentence did more for Rabbit than any marketing budget could have bought. When the person running Microsoft says something is the new iPhone, the conversation is over. Tom's Guide gave it CES 2024 Best in Show. The idea that the smartphone was finally about to be replaced felt for a few weeks in January 2024 completely plausible. 100,000 people pre-ordered, $20 million paid up front before a single device shipped. The first devices shipped in April 2024. The reviews came out the same week. MKBHD titled his video, "Rabbit R1, Barely Reviewable." Not bad, not disappointing. Barely reviewable because so many of the promised features simply didn't function. Spotify integration didn't work, DoorDash ordering didn't work. The AI-generated trip planning was unreliable at best, confidently wrong at worst. The camera produced images that looked like they'd been taken through a frosted window. Responses were slow, often inaccurate, and delivered through a device that ran hot and drained its battery faster than it could justify. But the hardware criticism, as brutal as it was, turned out to be the least of Rabbit's problems. A few weeks after launch, developers started digging into how the R1 actually worked. What they found gutted the entire premise. The Rabbit R1 did not run a proprietary operating system built around a revolutionary large action model. It ran Android 13. Underneath the orange shell and the scroll wheel was a standard Android device, and the Rabbit OS software was, at its core, a regular Android application. Developers confirmed that the Rabbit app could be sideloaded onto any Android phone. The device that was supposed to make your smartphone obsolete was itself just a worse smartphone, running an app that already existed that you could install on the phone already in your pocket for free. People had paid $199 for a dedicated piece of hardware to run software available on a device they already owned. Then came Rabbitude. In May 2024, a group of security researchers gained access to Rabbit's codebase and found something that should have ended the company. Hard-coded API keys, essentially master passwords, were embedded directly in the code. Those keys gave anyone who found them the ability to read every private conversation every R1 had ever had, change the voice of every device on the planet simultaneously, and brick every single Rabbit R1 ever sold, all 100,000 of them, permanently. Rabbit had known about the 11 Labs vulnerability since May. They said nothing to customers. They rotated the keys on June 26th, weeks later, after Rabbitude went public. And then journalists went back and looked at what Rabbit Inc. had been doing before the pivot to AI. The company had been called Cyber Manufacturing Co. In November 2021, it raised $6 million for a project called Gamma, a next-generation NFT platform. When the NFT market collapsed, the company rebranded, hired teenage engineering, and walked onto a CES stage 14 months later to tell the world it had spent 3 years building the future of AI. The returns started fast. Customers who had waited months for their device, who had watched the CES presentation enough times to quote it, mailed the R1 back in its orange box and moved on. The ones who kept it did so hoping software updates would fix what the hardware couldn't. Some of those updates came. None of them fixed the fundamental problem. By early 2025, the financial picture inside Rabbit had become impossible to ignore. Payroll started slipping in January, days late, then weeks. One pay cycle ran 37 days behind. By July, payments had effectively stopped. Employees went months without salaries. Contractors who had built pieces of Rabbit OS chased invoices that never came. In October 2025, 3 Rabbit employees went on strike over unpaid wages. Jesse Liu's response during this same period was to announce a next-generation device, a 3-in-1 AI gadget. Coming in 2026, he gave interviews, he posted updates. He talked about the future of the company with the energy of a man whose team wasn't standing outside with picket signs. The 100,000 people who had bought the R1, who had pre-ordered it sight unseen because Satya Nadella said it was the new iPhone, were left with a device that its own developers had confirmed was a worse version of the phone already in their pocket, running software that had briefly exposed every private conversation they'd ever had to anyone with a laptop in 20 minutes. No meaningful refund program. No clear path forward. The Rabbit R1 wasn't discontinued. It wasn't recalled. It just became something nobody talks about anymore, which in tech is sometimes the cruelest ending of all. Here's the thing about the Rabbit R1. The presentation was genuinely great. Jessie Liu was compelling. The device was beautiful. And the idea that AI could just handle things for you, that the app era was finally over, was one that a lot of people, including the CEO of Microsoft, wanted to be true. That's not a coincidence. That's the play. You don't sell 100,000 units of an unfinished product by lying to people. You sell them by telling them something they already want to hear and making it look the part. The R1 wasn't a scam, it was a pitch deck that shipped. And until we stop paying for things before we've held them, until a good presentation stops being enough, there will always be another orange box waiting at CES. If you want to know what's in the next one, subscribe.